Welcome back for another episode of Leadership that Liberates. And I have to say that every time I give this intro, I'm like, how can I make this more interesting? What else could I possibly say other than welcome back? I don't know. But right now, I'm just welcoming you back. So, welcome back. Thanks for being here. I am so grateful if you continue to tune in. Toward the end of last week's episode, I spoke about projection quite a bit, and it's something that I have referenced several times throughout various podcast episodes. So I really want to dive deeper this week into shadow projections. What is a shadow projection? So let's think about a projector. A projector is this device, it has a story inside of it. It holds some kind of narrative, story, depiction. And that narrative, story, or depiction is then cast onto something outside of the projector, onto a wall or onto a screen. So what is within the projector is cast onto another surface where we see the story playing out. So when we are acting as projectors, we are doing the same thing. When I am projecting from my shadow, it means that there is something that lives within me that is being projected onto something or someone else. And I am then seeing what is within me, but I am seeing it in the other person, on the other thing outside of myself. Projection often manifests for us as irritation, frustration, annoyance, criticism, judgment, resentment, bitterness, jealousy. There are usually two main reasons that we are projecting our shadow onto someone else. And I notice how often I say this is usually happening in one of two ways. This is usually showing up in one or two ways. We do this in one of two ways. But of course, I do want to highlight and recognize and acknowledge that oftentimes there's a lot of variation in there, right? But for the most part, most of the time, our behaviors are kind of showing up in one of two ways on average. Okay, not always, but for the most part. It's happening for one of two reasons generally. And again, this is with shadow projections. And as a reminder, our shadow, these are qualities, characteristics, traits that we often are not able to see within ourselves because they are parts of self that we have denied or disowned, repressed, suppressed, rejected. They do not align with who we believe ourselves to be or who we want others to believe we are. So they don't fit in with our self perception, our self concept, or how we wish to be perceived or received by others. On the one hand, a projection can be when we see in someone else a quality or trait that we do not like within ourselves, but do not even recognize is a quality or trait that we ourselves also hold. And so when I did the episode where I was sharing how to do shadow work and the different questions, this is why one of them is, what is it about other people that I often criticize or judge? Or what is it about another person that I'm often feeling irritated or annoyed or activated by? Because very often that is a projection of something we actually do not like within ourselves. And so we see it in the other person and it activates these kind of negative feelings because it's part of our shadow. Again, it's something that we have denied or disowned or rejected within ourselves. And so we see it playing out in another person, and it's something that we dislike in that other person because it's a part of ourselves we have not yet learned to accept and love. And so we cannot accept or love it in someone else either. The other way that shadow projections can show up for us is when we're irritated or annoyed by someone because they are demonstrating or displaying a quality or trait we have not given ourselves permission to demonstrate or display. So, on the one hand, we might see in other people something we don't like about ourselves. And on the other hand, we might see in another person something we wish we had, but maybe do have. We've just disowned or denied that part of ourselves. So if I feel really annoyed by somebody who is always complaining, and I'm like, oh God, I cannot stand it. That person is always complaining, always complaining, always complaining. There's a good chance that I'm always complaining, but I can't see that within myself. And so it really annoys me when other people do it. If I see, on the other hand, somebody who is very confident, very open, they take up a lot of space, I might be like, oh God, that's so annoying. It's so irritating when people are just so in your face. But maybe that's because I don't allow myself to take up space. Maybe that's because I keep myself small. And so to see what another person gives themselves permission to express, that activates or irritates something in me. I don't give myself permission to show up in that way. And so, of course, the invitation with this is when we are irritated, annoyed, frustrated, activated by somebody else. That is an invitation for us to examine something about ourselves. It's an invitation to ask ourselves either where that quality lives within us, where and how that thing that we judge or criticize is also a part of us, or in what ways is that thing that irritates or annoys or activates me an invitation into permission to be more of myself, to express myself more truly, more vulnerably, more authentically, more in line with who I really am, not who I was taught I needed to be or was supposed to be or should be. Anytime another person is activating us, and I often use the word activating in place of the word triggering because I don't really like the language of triggering. And I think we use a lot of language culturally that is related to conflict and war and violence. And there have been lots of studies and research done on this. And so I don't really like that language. But where am I activated? When am I activated by someone? And in what ways is that an invitation for me to deepen my relationship with myself rather than be upset at that other person, annoyed at that other person? In what ways is that an invitation for me to be in deeper, truer relationship with myself? Another thing about projections that is interesting, right? It's not only that we are projecting onto other people, but other people are projecting onto us as well. And very often, our insecurities and our self-doubt is rooted in other people's projections. Because when we are young and we are growing and developing, we are molding ourselves to align with someone else's projections. There is, of course, there are social norms, there's the cultural context we grow up in, there are messages from media, which are honestly also rooted in projection, but our caregivers, the adults who take care of us when we're younger, they are constantly projecting onto us, and we are internalizing their projections as truth about us when that's not necessarily the case. So a few months ago, I was in a gathering with a group of women, and we were talking about these kind of two different experiences. So most of us had either an experience of being shunned for our sensitivity and our emotion, or we had this experience of being criticized for not being emotional enough. And so, for those of us who were told that we were too sensitive, we were too emotional, that criticism often came from an adult who did not give themselves permission to express emotion, or who expressed emotion in really unhealthy, volatile ways, and then was very activated when they saw someone expressing emotions in a soft, gentle way. Or this person who doesn't allow themselves to express emotion, to be vulnerable, then sees you as being overly sensitive. And so, as a child, your sensitivity, your emotionality is activating for them. It's offering a mirror for them to see where they do not give themselves permission to be self expressed in actually very healthy ways. Right. And so then we internalize that as like, oh, there's something bad with me for being emotional. There's something wrong with me for being sensitive. And so we try to shut down that part of ourselves. On the other hand, the women who were criticized for being too cold or not emotional enough, this was a judgment who came from caregivers who actually had no ability to kind of manage their emotions and were just spiraling in emotion and would have these emotional spirals where they just had no ability to take responsibility for themselves. And because the child didn't meet them in that spiral, they were judged and criticized for being too cold because that child is then reflecting to the caregiver where they're not able to have ownership and sovereignty over their own experience. And they need somebody to meet them in that chaos to feel validated. And if that doesn't happen, it feels like some kind of rejection. And so then the projection is you're cold, you're uncaring, you're not compassionate. And then for that child, the story becomes that I'm cold, I'm uncaring, I'm uncompassionate. I must not be a very good person. I must not be very nice. And we create these stories and these self perceptions and these self concepts that are rooted in someone else's insecurities and someone else's projections. And when we are feeling ourselves insecure and we're telling ourselves a story about what other people think about us, again, that is often a projection. If I assume that someone doesn't like XYZ about me, and those are qualities I actually don't like within myself, I am projecting onto that person because I don't actually know what they think about me or what it is they do or do not like about me. But I tell myself, well, they don't like that I'm really assertive because that's something I don't like within myself. So, very often, the things that we are worrying that other people are thinking about us, it's a projection of our own insecurity. And very often, our own insecurity is the result of someone else's projection. And this is not always the case because something else that I see really interesting that happens is like once someone learns about the concept of shadow projection, they then use that as a way to deflect taking any responsibility or ownership for themselves. Because then it's like every criticism they receive is just a projection, so it's not real, so I don't have to care about what that person thinks about me. Other people's feedback is not always a projection. Sometimes it's true. And oftentimes we feel so hurt by other people's criticism because it reflects some degree of truth. And maybe we don't allow ourselves to see the truth in that criticism because it's too painful to accept that thing might be true about us. People's feedback is not always a projection. Oftentimes it is, and many times it's not. And this is where we have to be discerning, and that discernment requires us to be really honest with ourselves. And again, this is why this is an invitation into a deeper, more truer, more honest relationship with ourselves. And so, an example that I have for myself many, many years ago, a friend of mine messaged me and said, I've noticed that many times our interactions feel transactional because you will ask for advice about something, you'll ask for some kind of resource, you'll ask for a recommendation, but then you don't respond when I share it. You don't thank me. You don't even acknowledge that I took the time to give you this referral, this recommendation, this resource. And so she said, I feel like our interactions are often transactional or that I'm being taken advantage of in some way. And that bothered me so much. How could she possibly say that about me? How could she possibly say that? That is so untrue. That is not who I am. I care so deeply about people. I really love people. I'm the friend who stays in touch. I'm the friend who checks in. I'm the friend who maintains relationships. That was the story I had about myself because at one point in my life it was true, and I don't think it was true at that point anymore. But it was my self-concept. And so her feedback was so incongruent with who I believed myself to be that there was no way that could be true. And I felt so hurt and so upset. So upset. Like I couldn't stop thinking about it. which is probably an invitation to me to examine where there is truth in that feedback. And at that time, I didn't have the language of projection, but I did think it had something to do with her own insecurity and her own feeling of rejection and invalidation in some way. But I didn't believe that it was true, and I felt very hurt by it. And it wasn't until years later, I wanted to go message someone about something, and I noticed that I had never responded to their last response to me. And then that happened like the day after or the day after that. It just kind of happened like two or three times bunched together where I noticed, like, oh, I'm not actually responding to people. So then I'm thinking about this feedback this friend had given me, and I start to look at my message histories from like way back, like I go back into the archives and I realize that it's true what she said, that I very often do not respond to messages. And I think there are many reasons for that, but it was true that the way in which I was approaching certain interactions could very, very well be perceived as transactional, as opportunistic. She only reaches out when she needs something, when she wants something. Like, that was true. But at the time that friend gave me that feedback, I could not receive that as truth because it did not align with my self perception. This happens with my clients as well, because what I'm doing with my clients is shadow work. And so I am identifying and reflecting back to them the shadows that I see. There are times when my client cannot receive my reflection. They literally cannot hear my feedback. And I can like say the same thing over and over again in many, many different ways. They will not hear it if they are not ready to see that shadow, because that shadow is either so deeply buried or it's just so incongruent with who they believe themselves to be that they literally can't receive the reflection. It's just like it's like I'm not even offering it to them. They literally don't hear. It is completely blocked. And so again, when someone offers us feedback, it's an invitation to assess and not to immediately deflect what they've shared with us or to assume that it is a projection. And one of the key ways that we can discern whether or not feedback is true or not is how do we respond to it? Because if I receive some kind of negative feedback from someone and it really has no effect on me, like I am totally unaffected by what they've said, it's likely that there's no truth to what they've said, that it is potentially a projection. But if I need to defend myself, if I get defensive, if I feel like I have to justify something I've said or done, if I feel like like I'm like, no, I have to explain why they're wrong. Almost always it's because the feedback is true and it's reflects something in our shadow that we do not allow ourselves to see. Because to accept that truth would be too uncomfortable, too painful, too confronting. But that's also the reason we do shadow work. It is to confront the painful, uncomfortable truths that we choose not to see, but that secretly run our lives because we don't acknowledge or accept that those things are true about us. And again, with this, as with so many other things I talk about, this isn't just happening individually. It's happening on a collective level as well. You might remember from episode one, maybe not, but you might remember from episode one that I talked about the proximate other, this concept that came up in my research of war and conflict. And the proximate other is when we are in conflict with another group of people who are actually so much like us that it makes us uncomfortable, that we cannot see that we are actually so similar. That group is almost the same as us, but not quite. They're familiar, but still foreign in some way. And so we attach to the differences and we amplify and magnify the differences so that we don't have to confront the similarities. And this is so often what collective conflict, what wars and civil wars and international wars and ethnic conflicts are rooted in the proximate other. My inability to see that which I demonize and dehumanize about you is a reflection of something I do not wish to acknowledge within myself. This is why we try to create this separation, to create an other. We try to other people because we don't want to be like them, because they're our enemy and we can't be like them. And we literally fight over projection. I think all the time about colonialism. I think about these Europeans coming to the Americas and calling the indigenous peoples savages, barbarians, uncivilized. Do you know, I think that white settler colonialists, I think that white colonial settlers called indigenous peoples this because they were confronted with the sophistication of indigenous practices, the connection to the land, the ability to build pyramids, to track the stars, to know how to create these herbal remedies because of this ability to connect with and communicate with plant life. Indigenous peoples were actually so incredibly advanced, and that triggered for the colonial settlers this insecurity, this fear, this sense of threat. And so the way in which they unconsciously perceived themselves as inferior, as less than, as uncivilized, as barbaric, they then projected that onto this other group of people. No, you're that, because I can't see that that's actually what I think of myself. And I must make myself greater than you because the truth I do not want to confront is that I actually feel less than you. And I actually feel threatened by your superiority. So I have to ensure through my language and my perception of you that you are made to be less than, because that helps me feel in control. That helps me feel powerful. To paint a picture of your barbarism, your savagery. And then I go on to behave in uncivilized, barbaric, savage ways by murdering you, by taking your land, by extracting, by exploiting. But my story is that that's what you are, so that can't be what I am. It's a projection. Like I talked about last week, the fact that the US needs to paint all Muslims as terrorists is because there is such a stronghold of Christian nationalism within US identity. And because with that comes this self-righteousness and this idea that we have the answers and we are the only ones that understand reality and connection to God, and we're rigid and extreme and dogmatic and fundamentalist in those views. And so we look at cases in which that extremism is also reflected through another religion like Islam, and we attach ourselves to the extremist point of view, and then we say, look at those crazy fundamental extreme jihadists, look at those terrorists, they're all terrorists, because there's that inability to confront the truth that our, as people from the United States, so much of national identity is rooted in Christian values. And so when we see other countries who have their values rooted in Islamic tradition, well, they're evil, they're bad, they're wrong. Because it's like they're almost just like us, but there's enough difference that I can then demonize and villainize and dehumanize that difference. And now they're all terrorists. And again, this is a projection because who actually bombs the time? It's the United States. It's the quote unquote West, the global North, who are actually terrorizing groups around the world. But because we can't see that, we project it onto other people because we're just acting from our own needs, from our safety, right? We're just keeping ourselves safe. But those people over there, they're terrorists. When in reality, it's the US that is terrorizing the world, right? So these are projections. And we are literally fighting wars over projection. And we are literally fighting wars over projections. This also comes into play in what I shared around politics and polarization. Part of the reason that politics is so polarizing is because on both sides, or whatever side you're on, we don't allow ourselves to see that the other is actually so similar to us it makes us uncomfortable, that their rigidity is a reflection of our own rigidity, or why LGBTQ people, especially trans folk, are labeled and painted as immoral or perverse or sinful. It's again because these people are outside of social norms and they are giving themselves permission to freely express the fullness of who they are. And that is threatening to people who do not give themselves that same permission. So rather than celebrating this diversity, that diversity is perceived as danger because freedom of self-expression mirrors back to someone who confines themselves to rigid expectations. It mirrors where they are not free within their own lived experience. And rather than confront that within themselves, it's so much easier to then demonize the person who does give themselves that freedom to express themselves. And so again, it comes back to the same thing. If we want to break cycles that play out socially, culturally, collectively, we have to look at where they begin with us and how they show up in our own lives. And so where am I demonizing and dehumanizing someone who annoys or frustrates me? And how is that an invitation for me to be more honest with myself about where that quality also lives within me? Where is someone offering through however they self-express, the activation that I experience? Where is that offering me an opportunity to look at the ways in which I have suppressed or repressed parts of myself? When someone criticizes me or offers me some kind of feedback that really gets under my skin, that really fucking hurts, that really agitates me, that really angers me, can I orient to that criticism as an invitation to be honest with myself about parts of myself I might not be able to see, I might not be aware of? We are always being given opportunities to learn and grow and evolve. And the thing is that almost always comes in a form that is really confronting and uncomfortable. But unless we allow ourselves to be with that confrontation, to sit in that discomfort, to face the pain that is stirred up for us, we're not actually going to learn or grow and evolve because growth and evolution is not a comfortable process. It is disorienting, it is uncomfortable, but we do ourselves a disservice by not being with that discomfort. If our reaction every time we receive criticism is to deflect and defend, we are not serving ourselves because that is a lack of accountability. That is a lack of responsibility. And without accountability and responsibility, we cannot be in our sovereignty. And this is why we enter into these unconscious patterns, these loops where we're victims, where we're retaliating, where we're powerless. Because all of life is an invitation to enter into deeper relationship with ourselves and each other and the world around us. And depth requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires discomfort. And so, my invitation to you is to notice, just to notice over the next week. What are you finding yourself annoyed by in other people? Where are you finding irritation coming up for you? Where do you feel judgmental or resentful? And in what ways is that an invitation for you to look at what you have denied or disowned or rejected within yourself? And how much better could your life be if you were able to accept and embrace and love those parts of yourself? How would that change your experience of life, your relationship dynamics, your relationship to yourself? It's so hard to do. That's why most people don't do it. But it's also why our world looks like it does. And I really believe the only way to create a different kind of collective experience is to be really honest with ourselves in our own lives about how these things are showing up for us. And so I'm inviting you this week to look at the stories you tell about other people and ask yourself, how is this a reflection of myself? And if you want to reach out and share what comes up for you or what you discover, I would love to know. I would love to hear from you. And if you have any interest in working with me in this capacity, if you want support to identify your shadows and to alchemize the patterns rooted in shadow, I would also love to support you in that. I'm opening up some one-on-one spots for 6-month shadow work mentorship, and I'm going to include the link in the show notes for that. So if that's something that feels resonant for you, if it speaks to you, fill out the application and let's connect and let's see if we would be a good fit to do shadow work together. Because it can be really hard. It can be really hard for us to see these parts of ourselves, honestly, without outside feedback. Because again, the shadow is unknown to us. And so we really have to be just like radically honest with ourselves in order to be able to see what is in our shadow. And that's not always easy. It's not always easy. So again, our reactions to other people are an invitation to reflect on our own relationship with ourselves.